Hey everybody, welcome to today's screencast on Kashering Utensils, the laws of Hechsher Kalim, part of our unit on the kosher kitchen. Today we'll explore koshering by looking at three different topics. First, we'll explain why we kosher our utensils, then take a look at three different methods that are part of the koshering process, and finally wrap up with a broad explanation of what can and cannot be koshered. The Torah tells us, Lo tavashel gedi b'chalei v'mo. Don't cook the meat of a young goat with its mother's milk. And from the fact that the Torah tells us this pasuk not once, not twice, but three different times in three different locations, we learn three different things. The first and most obvious, you can't cook milk and meat together. Lo tavashel, don't cook them. But in addition to not cooking them together, we are not allowed to eat a mixture of milk and meat, nor are we allowed to benefit from a mixture of milk and meat. What happens if milk and meat mixture occurs in your pots or in your skillets over an open flame, or you use the same utensils for both milk and meat? Well, every time you cook something, the flavor, the ta'am, is absorbed into that utensil and stays there until you do something about it. So if you cook with milk and meat, those utensils now have a status of milk and meat and cannot be used until you fix them. How do you do that? That's where koshering comes in. Koshering is a process that removes these forbidden tastes and returns those utensils to a neutral status. Once milk and meat is cooked in these utensils, in the pots or the pans, or the silverware is used for milk and meat, those pots, pans, and utensils become flavored, so to speak, with the milk and meat and cannot be used for anything else. Koshering takes the negative status off of those utensils and returns those utensils to a neutral status. By the way, koshering is not just helpful in returning these utensils to a neutral status when milk and meat is used. It's also very helpful when it comes to getting ready for Pesach. Chametz, of course, is forbidden to be eaten in all shapes, sizes, and forms during the holiday. Our utensils must be chametz free as well. And so if those utensils were used during the year, even for completely kosher food, but if those foods were chametz, the utensils are considered chametz until we return them to a neutral status by way of koshering. But how do we actually do this? So let's take a look now in part 2 of 3 ways that we actually kosher, beginning with Hagalah, which is immersing these utensils in boiling water. What you do is you take a big pot of water and you bring it to boil. And then one by one, once the water has reached a full boil, a rolling boil, a continuous boil, like what you see in front of you, you drop the items in one by one until they are completely immersed in the boiling water. Now, you have to make sure that when you're doing Hagalah, that each item is immersed one by one, because if you drop them all in at once, the water will momentarily stop boiling. That's called displacement, scientifically, and will not return to a rolling boil until a few moments later. Now, the rule is that Hagalah has to occur with a rolling boil. So you want to make sure you drop these items in one by one, waiting for the water to return to boil before putting the next object in. In addition, you have to make sure that the objects are immersed completely in the pot. Because if you were to hold on to the object with your hand and only put part of it in, or use tongs and put the whole thing in, you're not really immersing the entire object or utensil, because the part that is being held by your hand or with the tongs is not coming into contact with the water. So the rules for Hagalah: number 1, make sure it's a rolling boil. Make sure, number 2, that you immerse each item completely. And number 3, make sure to immerse each item one by one so that you have a continuously rolling boil. That's Hagalah. The other method is known as Libun, which is applying red-hot heat to an object until it becomes white-hot, hence the name Libun from the Shoresh Lavan. Now, there's 2 ways to do this. The first is Libun Gamur, where you literally will apply a flame, like a blowtorch, directly to the part of the utensil that came into contact with the forbidden mixture. Now, this is only really useful for certain things like oven grates or oven racks, which are made of metal and can withstand the heat of an open flame. For other items, like an oven, we don't use Libun Gamur for obvious reasons. You'll destroy your oven. So we use something called Libun Kal, which is a variety of Libun, which allows us to basically fulfill the principles of Libun without actually using an open heat source. We'll talk more about Libun Kal in class, but essentially the way you'll do this is to turn your oven to its highest setting and to leave it there for an hour. Some ovens come with self-clean cycles that go for approximately 3 to 4 hours, but we'll have a chance to discuss how high the temperature has to be and how long the oven has to be on for when we return. That's Libun. When doing Libun, you have to determine, of course, which method is the right one. Libun Gamor is preferable when possible, so if you can use Libun Gamor, you should. Of course, when you do that, you want to make sure that you hold the flame to the item until the item gets white hot. This is only going to work for certain things like oven grates or oven racks. For everything else, like actual ovens, you would use Libun Kal, and you just have to make sure to wait the right amount of time and use the right temperature, but we'll discuss those issues when we return to class. There's one other method of kashering, and that is iruy. Iruy is the process of pouring boiling water over a certain object that usually can't be kashered in any other way. So we're going to use iruy when we can't use Hagalah and when we can't use Libun. And the most common case of iruy is sinks and countertops. You can't put your sink into boiling hot water, you can't take off your countertop, and you don't want to use an open flame on your sink or on your countertop because you could damage it. So iruy is a safe solution that allows us to remove a forbidden mixture that may have been absorbed into the sink or on our countertops by way of pouring boiling water onto the areas that may have become a problem. Just like Hagalah, the water has to be boiling hot. Typically, people, when they do iruy, will use a tea kettle. So they'll bring the kettle to boil. Once the kettle whistles, you know it's rolling, boiling hot. And then you can pour that over your countertops and over your sink, making sure to cover all the areas. So the guidelines for iruy are pretty straightforward. You want to make sure the water is boiling. You want to make sure you cover the entire surface of both your sink and your countertops. And of course, this will only apply to certain surfaces. Not all countertops can be kashered. That'll be something we discuss more in class. And not all sinks can be kashered. That is also something we'll discuss when we return. One thing to keep in mind is that kashering only works for certain things, and this is what I was saying a moment ago about iruy. Only certain substances and materials are actually able to be kashered. Anything made of metal and stone is okay, but something made of porcelain is not. And we'll explain the reasons for why that is when we return to class. There are certain things like Corel or Pyrex or even glass which don't really neatly fit into either of these categories. They're not really metal or stone, but they're not porcelain either. So where do they fall and how does kashering apply to them? That's something we'll look at together when we return. Today we introduced 3 different concepts in our introduction to kashering. We looked at why we kasher our utensils. We explored 3 different ways to kasher: Hagalah, Libun, which really has 2 parts, Libun Kal and Libun Gamor, and iruy. And finally, we took a brief look at what can and cannot be kashered. But when we get back to class, we have to go a little bit deeper into this topic and explore some big questions, like which kashering method do I use? When would it be appropriate to use Hagalah, or Libun, or iruy? And once I've determined which kashering method to use, what kind of steps need to be taken to prepare my utensil for kashering? It's not like I can just start with the kashering process. Certain steps have to be taken in advance to make my utensil, my pot, my pan, or my silverware ready for kashering use. We'll explore all those topics when we get back to class. Great learning with you. Looking forward to going deeper.